Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a pleasure for me to get up after my friend, the long-serving MP from Malpeque, who never lets the facts interrupt his rhetorical flights in this place. I enjoyed the fact that he said, a mere days after the Revenue Department confirmed a $1 billion surplus for November, he still thinks that is a fiction, Mr. Speaker, even though the Parliamentary Budget Officer has confirmed that the previous government certainly left a surplus. It was so good, Mr. Speaker, in a tight global economy that even despite their best efforts, they're still accruing the surpluses in their first few months of government, Mr. Speaker, and the facts state that quite clearly. But I'm very pleased to rise here today, Mr. Speaker, in relation to Bill C-2, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. And it's C-2 for a reason, Mr. Speaker, and we've got many members of this House, probably the majority of members of this House, are new members of Parliament, and they may now know that the first bill, an act respecting oaths and the administration of oaths of office, is a formulaic standard bill that starts off a session. So C-2 represents the top priority of a new government coming to office, Mr. Speaker. That's what C-2 is. And C-2 actually codifies what they brought Parliament together for 6 days after they won the election in October of last year, Mr. Speaker, to do. And that was to raise taxes on Canadians. So nothing suggests the priority of this government better than C-2. And that's why I thought I would rise in this House, Mr. Speaker. And what I find most ironic about C-2, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, an act to raise taxes, Mr. Speaker, is it kind of confirms the age-old nickname for the Liberal Party in this place, Mr. Speaker. And a nickname is a term of endearment. I respect anyone who comes to Canada's Parliament doing their best for the country. But Conservatives for generations, Mr. Speaker, long before I've been here or my colleagues have been here, have accused the Liberal Party of being the tax and spend party, Mr. Speaker. And what happens is their early record in their first few months of government confirm that, Mr. Speaker. My friend from Malpeque tried to suggest that it was a fiction that the last government, the Conservative government, left Canada in a surplus position, but that's exactly what the Parliamentary Budget Officer confirmed last fall, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, the Finance Department confirmed the numbers from November of another surplus month, Mr. Speaker. So the country was left with a modestly growing economy and a surplus. And the two things the government did in the short period of time they governed in 2015 were two things, Mr. Speaker. Make massive commitments for deficits, well above what they spoke to Canadians about during the election, and they raised taxes. So this is one of these occasions where the pundits who often say, why do the Conservatives call the Liberal Party the tax and spend party? Because in their first 3 months of government, they're raising taxes and they're spending out of control, Mr. Speaker. That is just the record that we're debating here today with their first piece of legislation or of their first bill coming to the House of Commons. And why I think this is important is because it is setting a tone, Mr. Speaker. This is not a bill that debates assistance or investments in a resource sector that needs some help, and the families affected by the downturn in resource prices who desperately need help and see mortgage payments on the horizon that scare them. It's not a bill about that. It's actually a bill about taking more from Canadians, Mr. Speaker, both in the form of creating a new tax bracket in an already fairly complex tax code, of taxing Canadians in the highest bracket more for income over $200,000. And it's also a procedure to lower the amount that Canadians can actually shield from tax through the tax-free savings account, Mr. Speaker, by reducing the amount that people can contribute to that very popular device brought in by our previous government and my friend, the late Jim Flaherty, Mr. Speaker, as Finance Minister. This vehicle not only allows families of all income levels to save free of tax, it was very, very helpful for people approaching retirement, Mr. Speaker, and I heard that and still hear that daily. So these are the two measures that are before us in C2. And I think nothing illustrates the concern I have, not just as a Conservative, but as a Member of Parliament who came out of the business community before I was elected to office. Nothing concerns me more than the apparent lack of direction that this new government has for our economy, even in their first few months, Mr. Speaker. And I'll remind this House, because many of the members that were elected in October did not get the chance to see their Prime Minister when he was a third-party leader, Mr. Speaker. And when, over a year ago, not long, but about a year ago, he refused to ever commit to running deficits, Mr. Speaker. In fact, he took a position that was somewhat similar to what the government had adopted, because we worked hard over the course of many years following the global recession to balance Canada's books. And to do that requires decisions of government. Government is not intended to just say yes to everything, increase every budget line, hire more people to every department. You have to set priorities and make decisions on spending and look at whether a tax base and Canadians can afford higher taxes in order to pay for more people in a certain department. These are the decisions of government, Mr. Speaker. And a year ago, the Prime Minister, then third-party leader, was committed to running a balanced budget, Mr. Speaker, as was, of course, the Conservative government at the time. And it wasn't until an election campaign that changed. So for a few years, the fundamental economic position of the Liberal Party was one of fiscal prudence. In the middle of an election, Mr. Speaker, there was a change in direction, a considerable change, perhaps for election advantage, perhaps because of a philosophical change. But it changed to running a $10 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker. And that was the commitment that was talked about with Canadians, and it was a temporary deficit, Mr. Speaker, of only $10 billion so that they could fill some commitments and add some additional infrastructure money on top of the already substantial Building Canada plan that the previous government had put into place. Within the first few weeks of government, Mr. Speaker, before this House was even called back into session, before you had the honour of occupying that chair, Mr. Speaker, that $10 billion commitment was already 20. And if you read the papers, as many members of this House did a week or so ago, you now see the Finance Minister hedging perhaps 2 years of $25 billion deficits, Mr. Speaker. Did Canadians vote for that? Did Canadians vote for the first two moves of this new government to go from a probably improper $20 billion deficit commitment to a $50 billion deficit commitment, Mr. Speaker? And their first act before this place to raise taxes on Canadians, and a tax increase that they said to Canadians would be revenue neutral, Mr. Speaker. Yet another promise that I think sounded and appeased people during the election campaign, but was not met and has already been abandoned. Ironically, Mr. Speaker, it was the C.D. Howe Institute, a think tank that the Finance Minister once chaired, that had said they would not be able to be revenue neutral on these tax increases. And that's for a variety of reasons, Mr. Speaker. From a public policy standpoint, the higher tax brackets are more mobile, so you could actually have the risk of driving more people out of Canada, out of our system of taxation. I was reading just this morning, Mr. Speaker, in the Globe and Mail, the great column by Konrad Jakubowski, who also identifies not just this tax increase as a risk to a lot of the tech entrepreneurs and new growing sectors, Mr. Speaker, but the fact that they're going to treat stock options as income, Mr. Speaker, is another thing, compounded with the fact that our dollar is going down, that this government seems to be set at driving talent out of this country, Mr. Speaker, at a time when a lot of people are looking for an economic plan that is far more than a Keynesian tax and spend approach with no strategic direction, and at a time when they're actually hampering increased revenues that are possible if we can get our resources to Tidewater with Energy East, Mr. Speaker. So we had a debate in the House last week where the Prime Minister seems to be putting in place a system and a series of consultations and reviews that will essentially mean capital leaves Canada because of the uncertainty of our business climate, Mr. Speaker. So it's with sadness that I rise today to say that C2 confirms the nickname of the Liberals as the tax and spenders of Canada, Mr. Speaker, I certainly hope subsequent bills start showing some real direction for the Canada of the future.
L'honorable député de Scarborough.
The honourable member for Scarborough-Agincourt.
I want to thank my friend from Durham for his comments in respect of the legislation that is before this House. And while I take his comments to heart, I do not necessarily agree with his characterization that that this particular side of the House is one that is tax and spend, to use his nomenclature. I want to instead perhaps ask, as he was giving a history lesson to this side of the House, and I know he might not have been here earlier, since he also joined the 41st Parliament like I did in a by-election. How would he characterize, for example, the $160 billion in debt that was incurred under his previous government, that was added to the deficit over the course of that previous government, in terms of how, when that was used at that time and justified by that particular government to deal with the difficult economy in 2008 and 2009.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud to answer that question from someone who indeed is a friend, and we were all very happy to see him get through a very personal, difficult personal challenge with his health and return to the last Parliament and then get re-elected, Mr. Speaker. I have a lot of time for this member, and as I said, nicknames are often terms of endearment. It's because we like you at the end of the day. And you, Mr. Speaker, of course, that through you to my friend, that the tax and spend nickname is a nickname, but C2, my goodness, they're confirming tax and spend as their strategy. And when it comes to the global recession of 08-09, which Canada led the G7 in job growth and recovery from, Mr. Speaker, certainly we did run deficits. No one's hidden that at all, Mr. Speaker. But we set a course to balance the books by the fiscal year 14-15, which takes decisions. As I said, leadership is not about always saying yes. Tony Blair was famous for saying leadership is at times about saying no. My father, who was a provincial member at Queen's Park, coined that term long before Tony Blair did, Mr. Speaker, that sometimes it means saying no and saying why by setting priorities. So I hope with subsequent bills before this place, Mr. Speaker, that my friend and my friends will bring forward a plan that is more than just taxing Canadians, more than just reducing their ability to save for retirement. We need a vision that includes resources, that includes new Canadians, that includes a diverse economy, Mr. Speaker, to make sure Canada stays on top.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cowichan, Malhat, Langford.
And I certainly appreciated listening to my honourable colleague's speech. I think I would just like to point to the record that all governments tax and spend. I've always hated that term. That's the whole purpose of government. We take resources, we pool them, and we spend them for the greater good. Now, my specific question to the honourable member is that we have figures from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and it's with respect to the tax-free savings account. Now, we have evidence on hand that the increase in TFSA contribution limits would have put a glaring hole in future government's revenues. And I know my colleagues across the way, they do like to support our military, which is one of the biggest consumers of the federal budget. So my question is if we are looking at with the increase in the TFSA at a $132 billion hole in combined federal and provincial coffers, how does he purport to balance the books when we're going to lose that much revenue? Thank you.
L'honorable député de Durham.
Honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank, through you, another new friend to this place for his question. And certainly, I think his question, as a member of the New Democratic Party, now that we're talking about the tax and spend concept, nothing underscores the difference between the three parties in this place better than this question. He looks at the TFSA changes and our increase causing a hole in revenues. Well, on this side, in this party, we don't see that as the government's money, Mr. Speaker. Tax and spending to us should be decisions about let's take the minimal amount possible from Canadians to give us the opportunity and the great services and quality of life we have here, but recognize that we're held in a trust to spend that wisely and only take it if we need it, Mr. Speaker. This is not a hole in our revenues. This is Canadians' money. TFSAs is an example where we're actually saying, you know, you've made this money. You can save with it and earn some income from investments without us taxing it again. Or the RSP option, we defer that taxation, Mr. Speaker. So that's what was so exciting about the TFSA. And I think nothing underscores the fact that we have Bill C-2 here, the fact that I got this question about holes in revenue, shows that only the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, really looks at this as Canadians' money that we're entrusted to spend on priorities and make decisions to make sure we don't take too much.